so much for being here. What a great crowd on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Thank you for noticing that we're doing it a little earlier today. I don't want to say too much because I think you, especially if you haven't got the programs, you know who this is, and that's why you're here. So I want to just start by acknowledging David Korins is here because we do prologues, as you know, periodically through the year, but we also tie prologues to shows. And while the connection to the show this time isn't tight, we are going to talk a little bit about this wonderful production that the students are just finishing up. Today is their last performance of Antigone. That's been directed by my colleague, Roberta Dupree. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a really good show. So I just want to honor that show. I was going to tell you, if you haven't seen it, see it this evening, but I don't even know if there are tickets left. It's been selling out every night. But if you want to try to see it, grab a ticket at the box office tonight at 4 o'clock. Prologue, as always, as you know, is sponsored by the Department of Visual and Performing Arts, by the Chancellor's Office, by the LAS Dean's Office, and of course, by TheaterWorks. And we aim to do conversations that are relevant to American theater and also the shows that we do right here at the Yen Center for the Arts. That's all I'm going to say. You know him, he needs no introduction. It is my immense pleasure to introduce back to Colorado Springs, David Korins.
I couldn't hear anything back there, so I don't know what was just said.
You just said something.
I just want to say a couple things. Talk about not struggling for your art. This is oxygen. Do you guys know this? I was offered oxygen backstage. I just said that it's high altitude, and then someone showed up with a can of oxygen.
We're very classy here.
Thank you so much for coming and spending part of your Sunday with me and us. Thank you very, very much. I was here last night. We had such a lovely dinner and a conversation, and it's such a warm community, and I really, really appreciate it. I'm very grateful to be here.
And I said welcome back, because here's a sort of tidbit that maybe people don't know. You've been here before. What was that? When were you here? Tell us a little bit about that.
I was here 20 years ago. When Murray Ross found me and said, we're going to open a new building and we'd like you to design the first show in it. And I designed Romeo and Juliet at what was then the new building, but that is no longer the new building because we're in this extraordinary place. And designing the first show in a new building is always very challenging because people don't know how to turn the lights on, they don't know where things go, they don't know how doors work. But it was a beautiful and warm community then, and even more so now.
20 years ago.
Yes, 20 years ago.
So I was joking that back when you were like 15, which is incredible that you were able to do this or work that. You've done a lot since. And we're going to talk about a bunch of the shows that I think everyone in the audience knows or has heard of. But I want to just start off by lobbing this completely unfair question. But is there a favorite show or moment that you've designed that you can get us started by telling us about?
Hang on a second. First of all, you're not allowed to ask favorite. That's like asking who your favorite child is. But what pops to mind, and maybe it's because I'm having a Pavlovian response to being back here 20 years later. When I was a young designer, I came to New York City and founded a theater company in 2001, and our idea was no readings, no workshops. I had seen a lot of plays getting workshopped with a promise that they would have these productions, and I thought, don't you kind of know when you read something, if it's good or you respond to it? And so we produced a series of plays, and one of the plays that we were fortunate enough to produce was a play called Blackbird, written by Adam Rapp, who's now gone on to write television shows and tons of theater. And we decided to produce it in a 30-seat room. It wasn't even a theater. It was attached to a theater. It wasn't even a theater. And we decided to wrap all 4 walls with brick, and it was about 2 people squatting on a Canal Street loft. They were druggies and drug addicts, and I guess those are the same things. And it was meant to be really scary and visceral, and we completely took out all the seats in the theater and wrapped the design around it, and I broke my leg. And I was on crutches, literally carving bricks by hand. And when the reviewers came to see the show, they had no idea it wasn't a real space. They touched the walls, they couldn't believe it. And in the show, the lead character smoked a bunch of cigarettes. And because of the proximity of the audience and the performer, no one ever coughed. No one moved. It was so kind of tight and very extraordinarily dangerous. Later, years later, I got an opportunity to design a Broadway show. You know, if someone is standing on the back wall and lights up a cigarette, people in the back are coughing, right? And I learned a really interesting lesson about proximity to the action and about how to create tension and how to really sculpt moments. And I think back to those early days and those early designs when I really built and painted and propped and kind of did all these things myself. You learn so much about the craft. And I think I'm thinking about that in this moment because of this building, and we spent some time with some students last night and today, and they're at this really important part of their educational process where if you learn how to do it by hand, you can sort of take that to all levels of entertainment.
Well, and it just strikes me, we were talking also 20 years ago to today, coming to see this. This is luxurious, this space, and I think we forget because we're living in...
I was given a can of oxygen. Someone could have also just been like, take 2 deep breaths. We brought roots. It's very bougie here in Colorado. I thought like coastal elite cities. No. This place.
Well, then let's use that as a jumping off point to talk about your education and development in the design world. How did you get into this field?
So I was, in high school, I was an athlete and a musician growing up, and I was also in the plays. I had a failed audition experience senior year in high school. I really wanted to be the lead in the play, and I didn't get the part. And so I was dejected, and I was asked to help the math teacher at the time, who was also the technical director, and build the scenery. And I did that, and I kind of was interested in it, but I knew when I went to college I wanted to continue making work, but I never wanted to have that really sad audition experience again. And so I took a course that was sort of like theater adjacent. I mean, it was in the theater department, but it was about beginning techniques in design. It taught you a little bit about scenery and lighting and costumes and sound. And I had a skill set for it, but I think the thing about it was I just worked really hard. I was saying this to you last night. Being on a sports team, and I was a very, very competitive athlete, and being in a band are kind of the same thing for me, right? It's about teamwork. There are sort of set plays. There's also improvisation. You can depend on each other. There's real rigor. And you have to practice, and that was never hard for me. You have to learn to love the practice, right? It's not really about showing up on game day. And so when I found the theater, it was the same thing. It was teamwork. It's a collaborative art form. Nothing happens by only one individual. And I got an internship at Williamstown Theater Festival my sophomore year in college. And instantly, it was this place kind of famous for working all-nighters and, hanging off of scenery and doing all this kind of physical stuff, and you were sleep-deprived, but it was a real community. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm used to doing, staying up and working hard and practicing and doing that stuff. And so I slowly but surely kind of worked my way through that program and also made all these connections. The great thing about Williamstown was we were building these large shows and these professional designers were coming in. I didn't grow up going to the theater really. I didn't really know that this was even a thing you could do for a living. I mean, I guess I had a sense of it, but I never really thought about it. And so Williamstown sort of showed me a trajectory into, oh, this is how you go from being an intern to an assistant to an associate to a designer and then eventually make a career out of it. And so when I moved to New York after school, I had all these years of working, helping these designers, and I just called them up and said, hey, can I assist you? But because of my work ethic, I was able to assist on Broadway pretty early, and I made a deal with myself. I'm going to design first if given an opportunity, assist next, paint beyond that, props beyond that, and then become a barista or whatever it was I had to do. And But I mean, I moved so young to the city that I would do that, but my goals were clear, and I had great success doing that. And I just basically, dialed down the assisting as I was able to kind of increase my design career.
So I know throughout the talk we'll sort of circle back to sort of early lessons and lessons for our students, which is so important, especially as the theater world is shifting so much. But I wonder if we could dive into a couple of your more famous designs as a way to get into some of that. And since you were here 20 years ago, a lot's happened.
Yes.
There was a little show a few years ago called, I believe it was Washington or Jefferson or Hamilton. I'm sure you hear that all the time.
I have oxygen, guys, if you need it.
So you said you were able to send me a few slides that I want to show. And I wonder if you could just talk us a little bit through the design process of that show. And this is the first one. It says Hamilton mix.
So here's actually what happened. Kevin asked for some slides of my process. I gave him a lot of slides, and then you picked your faves, right? It's interesting because this is a slide of what I would call what we said no to. None of these things are in the show, interestingly. And what I can tell you about them is, I don't want to say they're bad ideas, but they're not good ideas. Designing Hamilton was, the challenge there is we're not telling a story about the founding fathers. We're telling a story about the founding of America and building the foundation from which this great country that we all live in, or most of us I'm sure live in, and how it was built. And so one of the things that we were looking to do was to try and figure out how can we build something that feels substantial, like the foundation of America, but also is a work in progress, right? The play ends and it's only, 1782 or something. So how can we make it feel like there's a lot more to go? And also we were talking about all the other founding fathers represented in the show all have a monument because they went on to live long and prosperous lives, but Hamilton's life was cut short, obviously, and he never got a monument. And so one of the thoughts about the show was, could we make a monument? How are we going to end the show? And so the top picture is kind of like what the set looks like, but that kind of dirty area in the middle was my way of saying, what if we started the show with a dirt floor? And so we could watch, there's a number in the show where we talk about work and, the aspirational quality of the people and that everyone's building this country. What if we could watch them lay down floorboards during the show? The choreographer said no. If you saw the show, they're sliding all over the floor. That wasn't gonna happen. The second picture was actually a concept about what could happen at the end of the show. I was wrestling with how do you show scale and like the profundity of something like a country? And so I was, the first time I went to Rome, I saw, some of those monuments which make our monuments look like jokes. They're 20, 30 times taller. And I was wrestling with what the scale of a metaphor of the base of a column might look like, and you can see sort of the scaffolding on the side of that. And then finally, the last picture was also a moment that was supposed to be at the end. Could we make it look like we were framing up the Capitol building, right? The Capitol building didn't exist when Hamilton was alive, and could it be that? These are all ideas that we were playing with, and designing is redesigning, right? And so this is 3 of probably 100 ideas that we didn't go with. But if you know what the set of Hamilton, actually you might have a picture of it, right? Oh, so this is a white model. This is a model just sort of figuring out to scale what the show may look like, and every quarter inch is equal to 1 foot in real life with that model. But you can see there, the wooden kind of scaffolding around is holding up, right? It gives access to the quote-unquote builders of this unfinished half-built wall. And actually between Act 1 and Act 2 on Broadway, we fly in another 8 feet of brick wall. So between Act 1 and Act 2, in which 10 years passed or so, the war ends, they now go from war to governance. The massing of the wall in the set changes, and no one knows that happens because they're out buying merchandise or going to the bathroom or whatever they're doing, but they feel differently, right? They don't quite know what has changed, but in fact the foundation of the country has grown. And so that's what you see in that picture. I think there's maybe one more picture, right? That's sort of what it became. although a pretty dark and moody picture. I liked it. This is all Kevin's choice.
So could you say, I mean, we chatted a bit, a few years ago about the process of developing this, and it started at the Public Theater. What is it like to start in an off-Broadway, smaller house, and then as a designer to scale up to the Richard Rodgers Theater? That must be an enormous process.
Yeah, so every project that you do, there are no guarantees, right? And so whenever you start, I was fortunate enough to do a show this summer, or last summer, out of town called The Who's Tommy. It's a revival of the famous Broadway musical. We did it in Chicago. We had thought, oh, well, maybe we'll go on a national tour. It did really great business. It's actually going to come to Broadway this spring, which is really great. When we were doing Hamilton, we had a commercial producer attached. We thought it was really great. Everyone thought it was really great, but we had no idea that it would become a hit. We thought it would probably go to Broadway. It was probably the most sure thing of an off-Broadway show that I had worked on that would probably go. But it wasn't 100%. It was like 85%. We actually workshopped Act 1 over the summer at a place called New York Stage and Film at Vassar College. A whole year later, Lynn had written the second act. We workshopped the second act. A whole year later, we put the two acts together. Now we're 3 years recounting. In the fourth year, we knew that we would get a production for the Public Theater, and we designed the show just for the Public Theater. In fact, the back wall, which you don't see in that picture, but the little kind of blue in the middle, was the back wall of the Public Theater, and a lot of the choices that we made were about fitting it into that space. And because it was an off-Broadway show, we actually had to borrow, there are two turntables on the floor, we actually had to borrow the turntables from a scene shop, and we said, if we go to Broadway, we promise we'll pay you back. We borrowed the turntables, and the Broadway show is actually all of the structure down, all that scaffolding and all that stuff is actually from the Public Theater. So a lot of people think, oh no, Hamilton was a smash hit, and it was a smash hit. But we took the entire bottom part of the set and moved it on Broadway. And so the Broadway production is kind of the ricketiest, it's really held together with like contact lenses and dental floss. And there's like splinters and crazy stuff. My kids carved their initials into the set, it's still there. When we became fancy and we moved to Chicago and London and all, we built new sets. But you never really know. And even with the Surefire thing that is Hamilton, we had no idea that Broadway set is the Public Theater set, except we added some height to it.
So the scaling up is really not
well, in that instance, the footprint of the Public Theater, that theater, it's a very large off-Broadway theater, and so it kind of fit. But oftentimes, if you get lucky enough, the producer tells you, do what you need to do, but not what you want to do.
So, before we move on to some of your other iconic sets, how does the seed of an idea for a set start, maybe with Hamilton? I mean, you're talking about building monuments, but what are some of the other ideas that percolate as you're putting pen to paper?
So, with Hamilton, I can sort of see hands. Show of hands. Has anyone seen the show, or are you familiar with it? Yeah? Okay, great. So, hip-hop musical. Remember, with a new show, there isn't a blueprint at all of what it might look like. And in Lynn, who is a genius, the MacArthur Foundation told him so, but also we tell him so. He came into my office and put the script down. It was 51 songs, 25,000 words, 30 years of American history, and said, I have no idea how it moves at all. I don't know what it looks like, I don't know how it moves. And so it's my job and the director's job and the choreographer's job to try and figure that out. And they made me interview for the job, which I was a little upset about because the director and I had worked together like 6 times before. But when I did my preparation for the interview, I thought about it, and the 2 turntables in the show, I pitched in my interview. And I said to Tommy, the director, there's something about the cyclical relationship between Aaron Burr and Hamilton, how they keep coming into their lives. There is a thing about a hurricane came in and swept Hamilton off of his island, it devastated his island. There's this circular motion. I think we should do this. And he was like, nah. And never thought about it. I got the job, we talked, and we designed the entire show. We talked about, the building of the country, can we do a monument, how are we gonna put the foundation, all of those things. And then we were trying to storyboard the show and try and figure out how to get that crate on, that box on, how can we stage the duel, how can we do these things? And my assistant said to me, remember that turntable idea that you had? You should bring that back into the meeting. And I said to Andy, the choreographer, and Tommy, the director, I pitched this like 7 months ago. What do you think? And they said, neither of them had ever worked with a turntable before. And they said, if you can show us 10 moments in the show where we can use it, we'll think about it. And so I sat down and I sketched the duel, what we call the Aaron Burr, like the Aaron Sorkin walk and talk at the beginning, and all these moments. And I said, what do you think? And they were like, okay, let's try it. And then we tried it. And Andy, the choreographer, is a real, high level genius guy. And he's so anal and tactical that he staged the entire thing where every time there was supposed to be a turntable move, in rehearsal, the performers would move around. And then during Christmas break, before we moved into the theater, we got to get onto the turntable for the first time. The public theater opened up for us. We were able to get on the turntable for the first time. And when we did, the staging was terrible. It was terrible. And they were like, oh no, this is really not good. And I said to Andy, take every other performer and have them stand still. And what happened in that moment was the turntable moved the people, and the other people moved opposite of that. And the whole show exploded off of the stage in this incredible way where Andy had basically choreographed the turntable. And I was like, no, you can let the people get moved. That's part of the magic. And in that moment, we saw the show, and it was hard to imagine where the choreography stopped and where the scenography started. And when those guys, this is the longest story I've ever told, and when those guys, the four creative leads of the show got a Kennedy Center honor, the youngest people ever to receive it. And when they did, they had this interview and they were asked by Peter Marks, who was writing this big article about them, when did you know that Hamilton was something kind of more special in a play or a musical or a cultural experience? And they all said, there was a moment in the show called Helpless and Satisfied, which is this moment in the show, in which they set up we set up a winter's ball, and this is the moment in which Hamilton meets Eliza, his future wife, and the entire thing happens, and then it rewinds itself, and they do the entire show in reverse, and they do it back again. And they all said, oh, it was this moment where it became like choreography and CD and all these things happened, and the music and everything. And there they were winning their Kennedy Center honors, and I thought, I drew that moment. And I was like, you're welcome.
Well, I mean, that gets to this idea, the sort of the symbiotic relationship between a designer and a choreographer and the director. And you've worked with some pretty incredible directors and choreographers, and I wanted to maybe switch to talk a little bit about Dear Evan Hansen, which also, and I'm going to go to this sketch. I don't know what this is, but I like it.
Okay, so in fairness, show of hands, Dear Evan Hansen. Familiar? Yeah, a little bit less, but a lot, enough. Dear Evan Hansen is about a kid who has kind of social anxiety disorder. He's wrestling to kind of find his footing in school, and he tells a lie. He tells a lie, he gets caught in this lie, and then he doesn't know how to get out of it. But part of the social currency that he gets is that he becomes popular all of a sudden at school. He gets the girl that he's always liked, and he becomes really popular, and then we sort of have to root for this anti-hero, Taylor Swift. And so I went and saw a reading of the show, and I was sitting there with like my little program or whatever, and I was kind of just watching the thing, and I folded the paper up into like 16 little parts, so an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in 16 was about this big, and I drew that sketch. Now that doesn't do it justice because it's really big, but at this big it kind of was something. And my image was a little like tectonic plate, like this circular tectonic plate of life with a bed on it, floating around in like an inky pool of darkness with these little screens flying in overhead, like almost like a mobile, like a kaleidoscopic images, because a lot of the show takes place on the internet. Like it's a very kind of modern show in which you see them raise funds and the community kind of both come and celebrate him, and they raise a lot of money for a forest that they're building, or an orchard, that's the word. And also you see the internet for hate, and it turns bad for him. But it was like this little tiny voice, this little tiny bed, floating in this world with all these screens around it. And I then had a meeting after that reading, and Michael Greif, the director, and he was, famous for directing Rent and other big musicals. He said, "What did you think?" And I opened up the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and there were probably 20 sketches on it. And he went, "Oh, that one. That looks good," pointing to that. Big reveal, and there it is. There's the disc, there's the bed, and there's, the internet and all the screens. Better than the sketch. But that was an instance where he was like, that's actually really interesting and dynamic. It's about this, these people trying hard to communicate in this kind of world, this void of darkness. And actually the void of darkness, you don't have a picture of this, but at the end of the show, they actually build the orchard. And for the first time in the show, all of the screens go away, the black background opens up, and you have this big revelation of space in which trees pop up from the ground, little baby saplings, and all of the black walls go away, and it's a big blue sky. And it's quite breathtaking because we've set up this thing through the entire show in which you just feel a sense of permanent and darkness, and then it opens up.
Current show, another very famous show, of course, is Beetlejuice. And I wonder if we could talk about Beetlejuice vis-a-vis what is it like to design when there is a story that we all know, that, film and so forth. How did that come about? And I have a sketch and a final rendering.
Sure. So Beetlejuice, listen, I love Tim Burton as a visual designer. He's one of the great visual artists and filmmakers of our time. But the thing about Beetlejuice is Tim Burton doesn't just have one movie that he's made. He's created an entire aesthetic, like an oeuvre from Nightmare Before Christmas and Edward Scissorhands and Pee Wee Herman and all these extraordinarily specific visual worlds. And one of the things about Beetlejuice that we were trying to do is, first of all, it's a story about people who unfortunately die in their home and they're trapped, and the house is a character. Right, so the house is owned by one couple. They have this old Victorian house. Then they unfortunately die in the house, and then it gets bought by another couple, the Dietzes, and they make this kind of postmodern, crazy, fancy modern art house. And then Beetlejuice shows up, and he haunts the house, and so he changes it. He Beetlejuicifies it. That's a brand new word. Right here in Colorado Springs, you've never heard that. He Beetlejuicifies it, and so we had to figure out a way that this house could undergo all of these transformations. And one of the challenges was, again, it's interesting now hearing myself talk about this. How do you create a sense of permanence? You don't want the house to sort of let the air out, right? You don't want to think, oh, it's just a couple of little walls. You wanted it to feel solid, like a home. And so we actually devised a little secret with these walls so that they could actually, every single thing in the home could change except for the floor and the windows. So all of the surface, the railings, the light fixtures, the furniture, all of it could change. And the answer is magnets. I know you're wondering what the answer is. Kids, it's magnets. But one of the things that I wanted to do right from the beginning, the first scene, was to let them know, hey, I'm a Tim Burton fan also. And so the opening scene takes place in a cemetery, and we basically, aped the visual language of Nightmare Before Christmas, all that kind of claymation, all that stuff. Because when you see a Tim Burton show, it's so visually iconic. We stole things from Coraline and from all those different, there's a lot of little Easter eggs in there. And I think you have so this is a very, very, very bad early sketch of just trying to figure out what the house might look like. And then I think you have another, oh, well that's how it ended. That's the house once it's Beetlejuiceified. But all of those surfaces and all those walls kind of went away, and the only thing that stayed was that floor and that ceiling.
I just kind of want to get to this collaborative piece that you were talking about a little bit last night. Director of this is Alex, right? Alex Timbers, who you've worked with a few times, right? Talk about that conversation. How do you, maybe with Alex, because we're going to talk about Here Lies Love as well, but how does the conversation between the director and the designer start, and how does it develop over the course of the process?
Well, it's always different. I think that years ago, when I was of all people, I was Kanye West's creative director for about 18 months. That was very quiet. No one said anything. No one moved. I was his creative director, and people would say to me like, you know, is he surrounded by people who just say yes to him? And I would say no to him all the time. I think that whenever you're hired in this industry, you have to assume that you've been hired because people want your opinion. And the best collaborations are when you can actually stand up and say, I don't actually think that that's right, or my sense is it should be this, and someone else says this, and it's that great improv yes and, right? So it's like, I think it should be this, yes, and maybe it could do this and this and this. And so I've always pretty early on felt like, well, I'm either gonna get the job or I don't get the job. But if I do get the job, it's probably because they want to hear my opinion. And so Alex, the guy who directed Beetlejuice and also Here Lies Love, he's a contemporary. We're basically the same age. We came up, we both started not-for-profit theater companies. We were supporting each other years, you know, like way long time ago. And he's a real big thinker. He's sort of our generation's P.T. Barnum. He did Moulin Rouge, he did Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, he's a writer, director, and he's a super powerhouse, but what he is a very visual thinker. And he, you know, I'll wake up in the morning and I'll get an email, and it's like, do you look at the timestamp when the email is like 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, you're getting constant notes and constant feedback, and so the yes-anding goes on, you know, at all times of the day, which is exciting, and also so boring and tedious, but exciting. And so this is like, you sit in a war room, you know, when a director picks their creative team, the best collaborations are the ones where you don't delineate disciplines, right? So you want to feel like, hey, lighting designer, go ahead and talk about what the set should be. Hey, costume designer, go ahead and talk about the music. And those are the best collaborations. See aforementioned part of the conversation where I said, like, this is a collaborative art form. Even if someone says, this is exactly what I think it should be, there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I'm always like, best idea wins, throw everything against the wall and see what sticks, even if it's about what not to do. I mean, those first Hamilton sketches, which, as we talked about, we didn't choose any of those things. They were really incredibly informative because oftentimes, looking at something and saying, well, I know it's not this, allows you to say, well, what about it makes you know that it's not that? And then you can get closer and closer and closer to the bullseye. You almost never hit the bullseye the first time. You never do. So the conversation with Alex is incredibly, incredibly collaborative. And those are the ones that I think make for the best product.
And there's this other show that I mentioned, Here Lies Love, which was also Alex Timbers. And it's actually how I met you. I was working on a book about the public and I loved that show. I still do love the show. And part of the reason is that collaborative sense. You're also working with David Byrne, a rock star, Annie B. Parson, who is a legendary dancer. I really love to, it's on Broadway right now. I'd really love to talk about how that developed. It takes place in a disco, essentially. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting example of, okay, so this is a little bit of a story. David Byrne, lead singer of the Talking Heads, legendary rock star, literally, was at Studio 54 35 years ago. He saw Grace Jones do a pop-up performance in the middle of a crowd on a little stage. And he thought, that's such an interesting way to have a performance, standing up in the middle of a crowd. Filed that away in his mental Rolodex. A little bit later, Imelda Marcos, the first lady of the Philippines, right? The shoes, yeah, someone. It's like, I did immersive Van Gogh. You guys know what the immersive Van Gogh is? I did immersive Van Gogh. It's like immersive Van Gogh, cut off his ear. Maybe Starry, Starry Night. Imelda Marcos, shoes. Okay, so Imelda Marcos loved nightlife and disco. She went to Studio 54 many times. She had a mirror ball in the Palace of the Philippines. She had a disco floor in her townhouse in New York City. So David Byrne heard this, filed that away and thought, oh yeah, that's so interesting. Went to the Philippines, did a bunch of research, and decided he would write a disco club musical about the rise and fall of Imelda Marcos. I mean, listen, hip-hop version of the founding fathers of America, right? Like you go with me. So this is about now 13 years ago, he said to Alex Timbers, the guy who directed it, I want to try and figure this out. Alex said, I want to try and figure this out with you. I've been doing a lot of things, including, carving brick with my broken leg, and these kind of in-the-round experiences. We went up to a small museum in Massachusetts called Mass MoCA, in which we just tried to prove the concept of, could we make a show in which the stage was all around the audience, and the audience stood inside of it, and could we actually tell this story? We worked on it, it was successful, we brought it to the public theater, and we built a 144-seat completely in the round experience in which we told the rise and fall of Imelda Marcos in a nightclub. The actors walked all the way around on that kind of like rectangular donut, and they walked in the middle where that woman with the umbrella is, and that thing spun around. We lovingly call it the blender, because people who were standing inside of it would get moved around, and the actors were inside the crowd, at the top of the crowd, and there was actually viewing platforms, you can see them sort of over that pink line, looking down. And it was a massive hit. It was a huge hit, New York Times best-selling pick, the whole deal, big hit. And we couldn't move it anywhere, because it was that. It was that. That's not a normal theater. Probably it could play here in any one of your 9 theaters, now that I think about it. But then we couldn't, and so we went to London, in which there was a theater, formerly known as the Cottesloe, which we opened up in the round. It currently has an in the round production of Guys and Dolls in it. And we did this show, smash hit in London. And everyone said, you've got to move it to Broadway. We couldn't find a theater for it. There's no Broadway theater where this could fit. And so we then had an opportunity to bring it to Seattle. Now this is now 4 years later, bring it to Seattle. And I had this thought, the problem with the show being commercially viable is how much is it going to cost to build this physical production? How much do the tickets cost? And how many people can see it? And the problem with this show is only a couple hundred people can see it. So I had this idea that if we connected one side of the stage to the balcony, there's like 500 seats up there. And so all of a sudden, it changed the financial model. We did that, we proved that concept in Seattle, and it was a big, big hit. And now all of a sudden, maybe there was a way to bring this to Broadway. And so Alex and I made a handshake deal and said, we're gonna find producers, and we're going to find a theater. Now all the theaters on Broadway are only owned by one of 3 companies, and so we went with our little models and our renderings and our drawings, and we met with all the theater owners and said, hey, we've got this show, you might have heard of it, Here Lies Love, it's been a big hit in all these places. And we got a theater, we got producers, and the producers raised $23 million, and we ripped out all of the seats in the theater except for the balcony, and we put Here Lies Love into that theater. This is the view from one of the side galleries looking down. There are 315 people standing in the middle of the theater, and there's 800 people sitting. That's a view from the mezzanine, looking down into the thing. And it really is the first of its kind. There's been this slow marching movement of more and more immersion, more and more breaking of the fourth wall, building scenery out and all that. But this is the first time anyone's ever stood and moved around in a Broadway theater like that. And that is, talk about a full team, all skate collaboration. where the video design ends and where the scenery begins, or the lighting design, that's a top-down view of it. But there are thousands of feet of LED technology. There's hundreds of feet of video screens. There's 65,000 pounds of steel, because we literally built a metal structure where people can stand inside of it and sit on it looking down. And it's by far the largest and most ambitious design that has ever been on Broadway. Sadly, it's closing in 2 weeks because it was not a financial success. We can talk about that later.
While we're talking,
Do you guys need oxygen?
while we're talking, I'll let this play because it's a couple minutes, but this is a transformation.
I think the thing to look at with this is a very strange video, but you can see the theater proscenium, yes? Right there, it's the thing with the kind of the light circles on it. You can see these structures that are being built out, how far we've come out. So if you're like what used to be on stage, that's all the way in the back, and this camera is situated at the front of the mezzanine. And so you can see there are no seats in the theater. The entire experience when you go in is, unless you're sitting up in the balcony, it's a very bizarre, totally disorienting experience to walk into a theater and see no seats. And people love it. And it's strange to have an experience where the advertising campaign is one in which they show you people dancing around and all that, because the truth is, like, I don't want to go to a club, like, at all. And I don't want to stand up and dance like that, although I love being on the floor at Here Lies Love. But I think the marketing of the show is a real challenge, because if you just want to go see a brand new, sizzling Broadway musical, you want to know that you have a seat. And there are 800 seats in the theater, but all people see are people jumping up and down, and I think it has hurt the show. Well, I know it's hurt the show because it's closing. But it has been a really important show with a capital I. You know, Hamilton, we didn't know it was important, but it became important because of the multiracial casting, because of the way in which the story was told. This show is the first all-Filipino cast in the history of Broadway. This is a really important story about the fragility of democracy, and Imelda Marcos' son is now in power. We all think about the shoes, but we don't think about the fact that she actually, killed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and also, absconded with billions of dollars. And so the show is really important with a capital I, but it didn't catch hold. And that's an interesting, also a cautionary tale.
Well, and it caught hold 10 years ago in a small theater, and so this idea, we're talking about scaling up with both of these shows, that the sort of theater you do it in really matters, or do you think that's part of the issue? And it's fabulous on Broadway.
It is an incredibly special night. I think that the world has changed, in case you guys didn't know. 10 years ago, I think we were a little more accepting socially of rooting for the bad guy. And even Dear Evan Hansen, about that little high school kid who tells a lie, we shut down during the pandemic when all the shows reopened. Dear Evan Hansen was one of the shows that was going to reopen. And it closed rather quickly after the pandemic. Even though it was the Tony winner, the Olivier winner, which is the Tony in England. Excuse me.
Oxygen.
Imagine if I just die. Whoever that is, oxygen. She said it, no, he said it. Dear Evan Hansen was a big, huge award-winning show, but it asked you to root for a liar. Right, and I don't know how much that made it close or it didn't make it close, but other shows opened to great success and we're still running. And the thing about Here Lies Love is it's such an extraordinary experience in the theater, really and truly. I know people say it, unlike anything you've ever seen. But you're rooting for a bad family. And you get caught up in it because it's amazing. You're jumping up and down and it's really exciting. And then at the end you're clapping and you're like, wait, did they just enact martial law and kill 5,000 people? And you're like, I feel bad because I was at their wedding an hour ago partying with them. And I think ultimately, when we did the show back in the day, people loved it. And now people are a little more like, I don't want to publicly do that. And I think that when the very first preview, the very first curtain call, people didn't want to applaud for the woman playing Imelda. And we were like, she's an actor, it's okay. And we actually had to work really, really, really hard at the storytelling to we took her out of her costume, we put her in street clothes, we did a bunch of things, but that has changed. And I think that is just different now. Audiences feel different about it.
Could we talk a little bit in the last few minutes we have a little bit about immersive theater and some of the immersive work you're doing? This is sort of a plug, but I want to mention Antigone. We went up there to take a look at the set and what Brigitte has done with it, with shadow puppetry, and what we might call devised work. Similarly, TheaterWorks in December is doing a devised version of The Little Prince. This is obviously immersive. Could you talk about what immersive experiences are like and how you've parlayed your theater work into this sort of a world?
Definitely. Has anyone, okay, so we've heard about immersive Van Gogh, yeah. Anyone heard of the Museum of Ice Cream? Yeah. Anyone ever heard of a restaurant? Yeah, you're laughing, but yes. All of it immersive theater. Right? I think the thing that I talk about, and I have a 20-person company, this is what we do, probably 20% of my career is doing theater, what we would call traditional theater. Every single thing that we do is theater. A, performing, B, for C. That's it. You go to a restaurant and they hand you a menu, and that is a performance. Here are the specials of the day. This is what that is a design space. Sometimes there's music, sometimes there's food. That is a performance. And so I consider myself not a theater designer. I consider myself a multidisciplinary storyteller, right? And now, because of Amazon, retail is in trouble, right? Why would you go to a store when you can go get the thing, come to your house tomorrow? I mean, some people would say because it's nice to go outside and see people, but the truth is, our world has changed so dramatically that every single big business, it used to be that you would go to immersive experiences, it would be Disney World, Disneyland, or Universal Studios. Maybe a carnival, right? Now, every single big business, every single pop star, every single television show, every single sports team is making some form of an experience where you can step into the world of Harry Potter, step into the world of Game of Thrones, step into the world of whatever that is. And so all I do is help brands, organizations, intellectual property, and artists tell the best version of their story. Sound, lighting, technology, scent, all of it. People want to walk through things, and so one of the challenges we have as theater artists is the traditional model isn't going to work anymore. Why would you go sit in a seat in a presentational way and have to dig in and really listen to the words and all that stuff when you can go, walk around, touch things, explore, let your kids be unruly, and by the way, it costs $35, not $235. And so as theater artists, we have a real, we're at a crossroads. Think about the opera. The opera used to be the seminal way of performing music. That basically, the Metropolitan Opera would have gone away if not for those simulcasts. They show videos now of operas. That has completely helped their business model. And Broadway musicals and theater in general is struggling because the mold of how expensive it is to employ people for 2 hours a day. 2 hours a day. Think about a big, huge space like this for 2 hours a day. They're not showing movies 10 hours a day and then they open up the theater and turn it over to live performance. The business model is very challenged, and so if you could have a totally immersive, cathartic, and emotional experience in the round with your kids, family of 4 to go for $200 as opposed to $1,000, why would you do it? And you can take a picture, and you can show it, share it on social media, and so I'm helping people make immersive experiences. I'm doing them myself. Some are original intellectual property, some are attached to big TV shows or brands and things like that. But as theater artists and writers, we have to ask ourselves, the definition of theater is A plus B. A performing, B for C. A performing, B for C. It doesn't say on a stage. It doesn't say behind a proscenium. It doesn't say in a theater. It could happen on a street. It could happen in a park. It could happen anywhere. I feel like I was about to say that Dr. Seuss. It could be in a box, on the rocks. But that is the challenge, and I think that we have to make a choice whether to embrace that. That is not going away, and I think that happens because everyone walks around with our phones all the time. And all we're actually asking ourselves, like what we really want is, shut up, turn your phone off, pay attention. But people don't pay attention in the way that we used to, right? We don't have the same attention span. And I have 2 daughters. I'm always like, the way for success is to work harder, right? Just keep working harder, keep making things better. It's not about instant gratification. This whole social media thing is the worst thing in the world. But meanwhile, it's not going away. And so how can you embrace it? The moment right before inspiration is boredom, right? And so I'm always like, just turn your phone off. Just like turn off your phone, and like that uneasy feeling is that feeling that you need to lean into when you're gonna have a good idea. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we making? In what ways are we making? And the reason why Here Lies Love was able to exist is because a lot of people decided the experience of it being in the round was better than a presentational experience, which is interesting. And I think it's the way that all of humankind is going. Globalization has shrunk the world. Now you can be in Paris in 1 second online, Zoom, people don't even go to offices. All these things are storytelling techniques. And I think that the theater in the future will look very, very, very different. It doesn't mean it won't be theater. I just think it's gonna look very different.
For those of us who've devoted our lives to theater, and so many people here, there's a certain amount of nervousness hearing that, right? So the stories, Shakespeare, of Ibsen, of Zayami, of all of these extraordinary people and current people, Susan Ware Parks, that sort of level of, forgive me for this word, but rigor, textual rigor, do you think that's going away, or it's just we're going to make space for different types of theater?
So I think one of the great playwriting teachers at Juilliard once said, write what you know. Right? I know that sounds like a simple thing, but writers that, it would be hard for me to write a story about an African-American female protagonist. I haven't lived that experience. You write what you know. So, Dear Evan Hansen was written by 2 30-year-old guys who grew up in high school on the internet. And that show is reflective of that, right? And so Lynn grew up studying hip hop. And he lived the immigrant experience, right? Hamilton is basically the greatest immigrant story. So he wrote what he knew. Seen through the lens of something different, but he wrote what he knew. I think that we are going to continue to have writers. I remember the first time I designed a show with a cell phone in it. I designed a ton of shows with chords and rotary dials and all that stuff. And then one time there was a cell phone, and I thought oh, this is interesting. And then I did a show with a FaceTime, in which the 2 actors sat there and they opened up their computers and went Bloop. And then you were across the stage and you were going Bloop. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. That show couldn't have been written 10 years before because FaceTime didn't exist. And so writers are going to continue to write what they know. Shakespeare was writing about things in his time. And so I think that writers aren't writing with less rigor. They just might feel less substantive because they don't feel quote unquote oldie-timey. I once did this project with the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire about their amazing art collection in this place they live in. It's a manor house called the Chatsworth House, and I had the privilege of going there and looking at all their art. And I said to the Duke, he's a real guy, he's 76 years old, and he lives in this place, and his father was the Duke before him and his grandfather before him, and I said, what do you think about all this art on the walls? And he said, honestly, no one's ever asked me that question. It's like wall furniture. The only art collection that was informative to him and important to him was the stuff that he collected. And in that moment, I realized every one of the Dukes, going back 400 years, was collecting modern art. It's just that we were those sculptures, who makes sculptures anymore, those oil paintings. It's all modern art of the time. And so I think that the theater we have to make needs to be modern art. Dear Evan Hansen and Here Lies Love, when I moved to New York City, there weren't even LED lights. There weren't, it was like, we were like using a light board like this, right? Like now, and I remember I made my first light box by taking Christmas lights and sticking it under a piece of plexiglass, and it caught on fire, because it turns out Christmas lights are really, really hot when they're bonded together. It literally caught on fire and melted the plexiglass. And now we have LED Christmas lights, which some would argue are not quite as beautiful and Christmassy because they don't have the warm glow, but they don't light on fire. And so that is the challenge, right? It's like meet the world and the audience where they are and evolve slowly. But I think the word that you said that's the most important word is rigor. No one, like the idea of becoming a sensational designer, director, performer, or any of those things overnight, you know, the chances are zero. They're zero. You have a better chance of going out and getting hit by lightning. And you know, I was here 20 years ago. I've been the luckiest and most prepared set designer that I know of. And Murray Ross found me. We were trying to figure out last night how he found me. I think I was a really big hotshot when I was like 27 years old. I had a Broadway show. I was like the youngest person to get one. Like I was a big hotshot deal. And people are like, oh, wow, you came out of nowhere. And I counted, I had done 256 projects before that first Broadway show. It's like you're a burgeoning designer for 30 years, right? And so that thing is like rigor, 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 and then meet the world where it is, right? If you want to try and make a store that's going to work, it's going to be hard because people have Amazon. You have to make that store so compelling that they're going to go to it. That's going to be great theater.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say on behalf of everyone here, it's just a pleasure to have you with us. I hope you will come back and
every 20 years. You guys have the oxygen, I'll be back.
I just a bit of housekeeping before we give you our formal thanks. I gotta get David to the airport. He's has an opening tonight in San Diego. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop here, have maybe 10 minutes for the students to say hello and take a picture. But forgive me when I grab him and put him in my car.
Sorry. I said this to someone earlier today, and I mean this truly. This doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. My email is online. I'm totally accessible. If you have a question or a thought, email me. I'm around. I'm available.
And with that, I want to say thank you so much, David Korins. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.